Alright, so as for day 4, we're going to be talking about Judge, which is a one-episode OVA that was released in 1991, and this was actually my second backup one for day 4, believe it or not. Now, I don't want to get too much into it though, but yeah, there's a few interesting ones I really wanted to take a look at, but unfortunately, I couldn't find certain versions of it, or that, like, the one version I found, I had, like, no subtitles, so I couldn't review something like that. So, instead, I decided to pick something that is obscure, but obscure enough where I can actually find it, and that being Judge. So, without further ado, let's just get right to it and talk about the story. So it begins with our main character Oma, who happens to be a businessman who doesn't really get a lot of things done. In fact, one of his other partners named Murakami ends up taking advantage of him all the time because he's a piece of shit. But it turns to find out that our main character has this really weird power where he turns into the Judge of Darkness, where he judges criminals that got away scot-free, and therefore punishing and killing those that got away with murder and other shitty situations. And by the way, he happens to carry around a book that is made out of flesh and even has a heart and everything, so yeah, it's kind of weird. It's almost like a Necromonicon. So I guess if you think about it, he's kind of like Yami within the Yu-Gi-Oh! Season 0, where he was actually punishing people, but instead of making him play a game, he ends up just killing his ass right on the spot. So after he ends up punishing Murakami, he ends up finding out that his vice president of the company was actually killed by a bunch of hired men who was hired by Kawamata, who happens to be the one who took over the company after he left. So now our main character Oma is trying to look for him so that he can punish him for his evil deed. But Kawamata ends up meeting a very mysterious person who I can't seem to remember his name. Hell, I don't even think they ever said his name out loud. Well, whatever. Basically, he's a lawyer, and he has similar powers to the Judgment of Darkness, but only that he actually is a defense attorney. Also, he's one of the few characters in this show that is somewhat recognizable, given the fact that he kinda looks like a vampire hunter than anything. So they make a deal so that he can be protected by the Judge of Darkness. And eventually later on, there is a courtroom scene that actually takes place in hell, which is a pretty interesting concept, and yeah, that's pretty much all I'm gonna say about the story. So if you think about it, it's basically about having lawyers with like really weird supernatural powers, but they take care of court cases within hell. In a strange way, this one does kinda remind me of the movie's Devil's Advocate, the one with Keanu Reeves and Al Pacino. Obviously, it's not exactly like it, but it does have some similar elements with the whole like lawyers and the devil and all that kind of funky shit. So yeah, kinda unique for an anime, and by the way, this was based after a manga that came out in 1987. So now, let's get talking about the other things, like the animation. So the animation in this one is okay. It's nothing great, but it's nothing terrible, but I think for low budget standards, which you can obviously tell this is a low budget anime, it's definitely not the worst. It's serviceable, but it's nothing mind-blowing or amazing, and the character designs are for the most part pretty forgettable, although I do find that the two characters, being the Judge of Darkness and the lawyer guy, are probably the most recognizable ones, and are the most well-detailed. But even those guys aren't like the coolest looking characters ever, but I do think they do look pretty good for what they are. But yeah, it's fairly standard stuff. So now, as for the show's music, the music in this one is also not really memorable, but I do think it is pretty good for what it is. So you get some dark atmospheric stuff, which is pretty fitting, and there is actually one song with like the organ piano, which I thought was kinda cool sounding, but other than that, it's nothing mind-blowing, but it works. So now, as for the voice acting, if you're gonna watch this one in English, it's pretty fucking bad. For the most part, it is one of the more mediocre dubs where there's really nothing memorable about like the voice acting being so terrible, but at the same time, there is some amusing parts. For an example, within the courtroom scene near the end, the lawyer guy is trying to tell them all that his client is innocent, and he sounds almost a lot like this. My client is innocent. Okay, maybe not as ridiculous as that, but it's pretty damn close. Like, the voice is just so unfitting to how he looks in this one that it's just laughably bad. It almost seemed like they were trying to make him out to be like some like cartoon villain of a kid's show. But other than this, there's really not much else to say about the voice acting. It's pretty bland. So I'm pretty sure you know what I'm gonna say by now. If you want to watch this one to be more serious, then watch it in Japanese, unless you want to watch the English version for like one character who is like kinda goofy, but not like super over the top. So, as for my overall thoughts on Judge, is that despite the story concepts being somewhat interesting, the show itself is just not really all that exciting. So all the characters are pretty forgettable and really don't flesh out at all. I mean, for an example, the main character, you don't even know like how he even got like the weird crazy powers that he has to become like a judge of darkness. It just kinda happens. I don't know, did he get it from like the demonic bird that he has, or did he have it from having sex with one of his coworkers? I don't know. But I'm willing to bet that the book that it's based after probably does explain this, and here's something I have to mention when it comes to OVAs that are based after mangas. A lot of the times, if there's an OVA based after a manga and you only watch the OVA without reading the book, chances are that if you haven't read the book, you're probably going to be missing a lot of elements to the OVA because, unfortunately, not all OVAs can capture everything that happens within a manga. A good example of this is with Apocalypse Zero, which by the way, I'm not going to be reviewing it this year, but if you talk to people that have read the book to it, they'd tell you that it's actually really good. But you ask anyone that has only seen the OVA, then they probably would tell you that it's terrible. But if you experience both, yeah, the OVA is obviously inferior, but you can kind of get into it in the sense that you actually know all the backstory and like the characterization and all that. Where if you have no knowledge of that, then you probably would just write it off as just being stupid and terrible. While I'm willing to bet that if the book for Judge was actually good, I think this might be one of those cases where if you read the book and then watch this OVA, you probably might be able to get some enjoyment out of it, but it's nothing that you would call great. But even if the book was good though, it doesn't change the fact that this movie is kinda boring and doesn't really have a whole lot of like fun factor to it, at least in my opinion. Hell, even most of like the shock value parts, quote unquote, are really nothing all that shocking. In fact, probably the most what the fuck thing that happens in this one is that there's a part where Kawamata is in the elevator and he ends up hallucinating a zombie who has like his eye popping out, and then after that it starts like raining crabs for no reason. Yes, I didn't make that up, that actually happens. But as much as an acid trip as that sounds though, that's really the worst it gets. Everything else is pretty tame and really nothing memorable. So even if you wanted to watch this for like mindless fun, it doesn't even really do a good job at that either. So yeah, I can't really recommend this one. There's just really not a whole lot of stuff to it that I really liked, other than that the concept was kinda interesting, and maybe I would like to check out the book for that it could actually be really good, but other than that though, it was a pretty forgettable one. But hey, look at the bright side, at least if you want to own a physical copy of it, it's like super freaking cheap.